Veteran found a crashed jet in the mountains, looked inside, and froze in horror. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The mountain air was cold and thin, a biting reminder of the wilderness that stretched out endlessly before him. The sun had already begun its descent behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows over the rocky terrain. The faint sound of crunching snow beneath boots echoed in the otherwise silent surroundings as Jim Foster, a seasoned veteran, made his way along the narrow path that wound through the rugged mountain pass. Jim had been many things in his life: a soldier, a father, and a survivor. But now, as he ventured deep into the wilderness, he had only one thing on his mind: peace. After years of service and a lifetime of scars, both seen and unseen, the mountains seemed to offer him the solitude he craved. His loyal German shepherd, Shadow, trotted just ahead, her ears flicking at every gust of wind. Jim glanced at her, the two of them familiar companions in the silence of nature. As he neared the crest of the mountain, something caught his eye, a glint of metal reflecting the last rays of sunlight. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. The outline of something large and unnatural, something that didn't belong in these parts. His heart skipped a beat as he took a few steps closer, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. What he found stopped him dead in his tracks. A jet crashed, partially buried under a blanket of snow, but unmistakably there. The massive plane, its body scarred and twisted, lay sprawled out against the harsh mountainside. Jim's military training kicked in, his instincts sharpening as he scanned the wreckage. The jet's insignia was unrecognizable, but the shape and size suggested it was military. This was no ordinary crash. As he approached the wreck, the unsettling feeling of something being out of place gnawed at him. The jet's wings were crumpled, and the cockpit was shattered, but there was no sign of any survivors. No bodies, just the twisted remnants of metal and machinery. He knelt down, feeling a cold gust of wind bite at his face, as if the mountain itself was trying to push him away. But his curiosity got the better of him. Jim took a deep breath, steeling himself against the unease that was building in the pit of his stomach. He had seen the aftermath of many crashes in his time, but something about this one felt wrong. Shadow, ever alert, stood at attention by his side, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. Then, he saw it. A faint glow coming from within the wreckage, an eerie light that didn't seem to belong to the dying embers of the day. Jim froze. A chill ran down his spine, not from the cold, but from something much deeper. His eyes narrowed as he took cautious steps forward, reaching for the edge of the cockpit. As his fingers brushed against the metal, a soft hum reverberated through his body, a low, vibrating pulse that seemed to come from the very heart of the wreck. The glow intensified, and for a moment, everything around him fell into an unnatural silence. His breath caught in his throat as he slowly leaned in closer, peering through the shattered glass. Inside, the cockpit was alive. A strange device sat in the center of the wreckage, its surface glowing with an otherworldly light. Jim's heart pounded as he recognized the markings on the device, the symbols he had seen once, many years ago, during a mission he had long since tried to forget. He reached in, pulling at the wreckage, and for the first time in years, fear gripped him. What had he stumbled upon? Ironically, the moment he laid his hands on the strange, glowing device inside the wreckage, Jim realized he had crossed a line. He couldn't explain it, but something about the hum coming from the jet made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Shadow, who had been unusually quiet, let out a low whine, her amber eyes flicking nervously toward the glowing object. Jim slowly backed away from the wreck, his fingers trembling as he released the twisted metal he had been holding. He stood still, listening to the eerie silence around him, broken only by the distant howling wind. The glow from the cockpit cast a ghostly light across the snow, and the world seemed to close in around him. His mind raced. What had he just discovered? Was this a secret military project? Or something far more sinister? Shadow padded toward him, sniffing the air warily. Her fur bristled as if sensing something Jim couldn't see, a feeling that deepened with each passing second. He turned back toward the wreckage, his heart pounding. Something wasn't right. The ground beneath him felt oddly alive, vibrating, as if the mountain itself was responding to the presence of the jet. Jim hesitated, unsure of what to do next. The more he looked at the device, the more it felt like it was calling to him, pulling him in. Something about the markings, the symbols he couldn't understand, made his skin crawl. His military training told him to report this immediately, to call it in and let the authorities deal with it. But another part of him, the part that had seen too much in his years of service, knew that this was no ordinary discovery. This was something far beyond the scope of his understanding. With a deep breath, Jim made a decision. He wasn't going to leave until he figured this out. He took one more look at the cockpit and turned back to Shadow. "Stay close," he muttered to her. He grabbed a small flashlight from his bag, its beam weak against the growing darkness, and made his way toward the tail of the jet, where the wreckage was most intact. As he approached, the humming sound seemed to intensify. It wasn't just the sound of the machine. It felt almost alive, as though the jet had a heartbeat of its own. Jim's pulse quickened as he reached the rear of the jet. The tail was bent at an impossible angle, but Jim noticed something strange. A small compartment on the side was slightly ajar, as if it had been tampered with. He crouched down and tried to open it further, his breath fogging in the cold air. The compartment slid open with an unnatural ease, and Jim's heart skipped a beat as he peered inside. At first, he thought it was just more broken pieces of the jet, but then he saw it. Another object. Small, rectangular, and covered in a thin layer of dust, but its edges gleamed in the dim light. It was wrapped in a dark cloth, and something about it drew him in like a magnet. Jim hesitated for only a moment before reaching inside. As soon as his fingers brushed the cloth, the hum from the jet escalated to an almost deafening pitch, and the temperature around him seemed to drop. He pulled back, startled, but quickly regained his composure. With a steady hand, he unwrapped the cloth. His breath caught in his throat as he revealed what lay beneath. It wasn't just any piece of technology. It was a small, intricately designed device, unlike anything Jim had ever seen before. Its surface was covered in strange symbols that looked ancient, as though they belonged to a civilization long lost to time. But there was something else, something he couldn't explain. The object seemed to pulse with energy, and Jim could feel it in his bones, vibrating through his fingertips. He stared at it for a moment, his mind racing with possibilities. Was this alien technology? Some sort of ancient artifact? Or was it something even more dangerous? His thoughts were interrupted by a low growl from Shadow. She had backed away from him, her hackles raised, eyes locked on the surrounding darkness. Jim's breath hitched as he scanned the area, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. There was something out there, something watching them. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The silence of the mountain had become oppressive, and the air had thickened with a sense of dread. Shadow let out another growl, this one deeper and more urgent. Jim instinctively reached for the rifle slung across his back, his senses on high alert. He could no longer ignore the feeling that they were not alone. There was a presence out here in the mountains, something ancient and powerful, and it was watching him. He looked down at the device in his hand. His pulse raced as he made the connection. The object wasn't just a piece of technology, it was a key to something far larger, something he wasn't ready to understand. And the moment he had touched it, the mountain had awakened. Jim stood still, the eerie hum from the device in his hand growing louder, filling his ears with a vibration that seemed to match the beating of his heart. The mountain was no longer just a silent backdrop to his discovery. It had become alive, breathing, pulsing in rhythm with the strange object he had uncovered. His fingers tightened around the device, and for the briefest moment, he felt something deep within his chest, a powerful force, as though the jet itself was somehow connected to the land, to the very soul of the mountains. Shadow growled again, her body tense as she stood at Jim's side, her eyes darting back and forth across the darkening landscape. Jim's breath came in shallow bursts as he realized the weight of what he had stumbled upon. This was no ordinary wreckage. It wasn't even just an abandoned military jet. There was something else here, something hidden, waiting to be uncovered. He felt it in the pit of his stomach, an unsettling certainty that the mountains had been keeping secrets long before the jet had ever crashed. Without thinking, he slid the device into his pack and began to back away from the wreckage. His instincts told him to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible, but his curiosity was too strong. He couldn't just walk away from this. The mountain itself seemed to be calling him, urging him to stay. As he took a step back, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a set of footprints in the snow. They were fresh, unmistakable, and they led toward the edge of the wreckage. Jim froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Shadow's growl became more urgent, and Jim could feel his body tensing in response. Someone had been here recently. Someone was still here. Slowly, he followed the footprints, moving cautiously, his rifle held at the ready. The footprints led him to the base of a steep cliff, where the snow had been disturbed. There, at the edge, was a small, well-worn trail that seemed to lead up the mountain. Jim's eyes narrowed. The trail didn't make sense. It wasn't the path of a hiker or a mountaineer. It was too deliberate, too intentional. Whoever had left these tracks knew the mountain well. He glanced at Shadow, who was now standing completely still, her ears pricked up, her gaze fixed on the trail ahead. She let out a low whine, her body tense with an unease that mirrored Jim's own. Without a word, he motioned for her to follow, and they started up the trail together, the crunch of their boots the only sound in the vast silence of the mountain. The path was narrow, winding its way through the jagged rocks, and the higher they climbed, the more the temperature seemed to drop. The air was thin, biting, and with every step, Jim felt the weight of the unknown bearing down on him. His mind raced with possibilities. Was he being led somewhere? Or was someone, or something, waiting for him at the top? The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing moment. As they neared the summit, the trail narrowed to a single track, barely wide enough for Jim to place his boots. The rocks underfoot became slick with ice, and the wind howled through the peaks, making every movement feel like a battle against nature itself. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following him, that this wasn't just a journey up the mountain. It was a test, a game, and he was the player in someone else's story. Shadow stopped suddenly, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. Jim held his breath, listening intently. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. The mountain seemed to hold its breath as well, waiting. There, in the distance, he saw something. A faint light, flickering through the trees. It wasn't the glow of a campfire. It was colder, more intense, like the gleam of metal in the night. Jim's pulse quickened as he approached the light. Shadow growled again, low and warning, and Jim's grip on his rifle tightened. As they drew closer, the light grew brighter, revealing a structure hidden among the trees, an old cabin, its walls weathered and covered in thick layers of moss. The cabin looked as though it had been abandoned for years, yet the light emanating from within suggested otherwise. Jim approached cautiously, his every step deliberate, as though the ground beneath him might give way at any moment. Shadow, ever the protector, stood at his side, her senses on high alert. Jim stopped just short of the cabin, his breath visible in the cold air. He could hear something coming from inside, a low hum, almost like a machine running. It was the same sound he had heard back at the wreckage, only now it was clearer, more defined. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as he realized what it was. The cabin wasn't just abandoned. It was alive, pulsing with an energy he couldn't explain. And just as he was about to step forward, a figure appeared in the doorway. A man, tall and cloaked in shadows, stood framed by the light from inside the cabin. Jim's heart skipped a beat. The man didn't speak, but his presence was enough to send a shiver down Jim's spine. The figure motioned for Jim to come closer, and before Jim could react, Shadow took a step forward, her body tense, her eyes locked on the figure. Jim hesitated, his mind torn between caution and the irresistible pull of curiosity. Whatever lay ahead was no accident. The mountain, the jet, the device, it was all connected. And now, this figure, this mysterious man in the doorway, seemed to be the key to unlocking the truth. With a deep breath, Jim stepped forward, his heart pounding, knowing that he was about to step into a world of mysteries far darker and more dangerous than anything he had ever faced. Jim stood motionless, the figure in the doorway still. His heart raced, adrenaline pumping through his veins, and yet a strange calm washed over him as he locked eyes with the man. The figure in front of him was tall, his face hidden in shadow, but there was an undeniable sense of authority about him. The man's presence was commanding, as if he had been waiting for Jim all along. "Come inside," the man said, his voice low, but not unkind. Jim hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to be cautious, but curiosity and the weight of the mysterious events so far urged him forward. Shadow, usually so protective and wary, stood silent at his side, her body slightly relaxed. Jim wasn't sure if she felt the same pull he did, but the dog seemed strangely at ease in the man's presence. With a deep breath, Jim took the first step towards the cabin, feeling the cold bite of the air against his skin. The door creaked as it opened fully, revealing the dimly lit interior. Inside, the warmth was palpable, a stark contrast to the freezing cold outside. The flickering light of candles and an old-fashioned lantern cast long shadows on the walls, which were lined with shelves filled with strange, ancient artifacts. Jim's eyes flicked over the objects, trying to make sense of what they were. There were old maps, relics that looked like they belonged to another time, and even odd tools Jim had never seen before. It was as if he had stepped into a different world altogether. The man motioned for Jim to sit, and he did so, warily, on a wooden chair near a stone fireplace where a small fire crackled. Shadow lay down beside him, her eyes still fixed on the man. Jim felt the weight of the moment settle on him as the man sat across from him, studying him with those piercing eyes. "You must be wondering what this all means," the man said, his voice now a bit softer. Jim nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened, from finding the jet to the strange energy that pulsed from the device in his pack. "What is this place?" Jim finally asked, his voice low but steady. "This is where things change," the man replied. "This is where the truth lies. The truth about what brought you here, the truth about the jet, and the truth about your role in all of this." Jim leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean, my role?" The man smiled, a small, knowing smile, before standing and walking over to a table where a large map lay spread out. He gestured for Jim to join him. Reluctantly, Jim stood and approached, his mind still spinning. As he looked at the map, he realized it was a map of the very mountains they were in, but there were marks on it, red circles and strange symbols that seemed to have been placed deliberately. "You've been chosen," the man said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Chosen for what?" Jim asked, the question hanging in the air. The man turned to face him, his eyes intense. "To uncover the truth," he replied. "The jet you found, the device, they are pieces of a much larger puzzle. The symbols on that map, the ones you've seen before, they are the key to unlocking something ancient. Something that has been hidden in these mountains for centuries." Jim's mind was reeling. Ancient? Hidden? Was he really hearing this right? "I don't understand," Jim said, shaking his head. "What are you talking about? What's hidden here?" The man looked at Jim, his expression unreadable for a moment, before he spoke again. "There's more to this mountain than just rocks and snow. There's a secret, a powerful secret, buried deep within. The jet was meant to find it, but something went wrong. The device you found, it's not just technology. It's a map, a guide. And you, Jim, you are the one who is meant to follow it." Jim's pulse quickened as he felt the weight of the man's words settle on him. This wasn't just about a crashed jet or some military operation gone wrong. This was something much bigger, something that could change everything he knew about the world. He glanced over at Shadow, who was now lying down, her eyes closed but her body still tense. It was as though she too understood that they were on the precipice of something they couldn't yet comprehend. "What do I have to do?" Jim asked, his voice steady but laced with a sense of urgency. "You must go deeper into the mountains," the man said, his voice low but firm. "There is a cave, a hidden cave. Inside, you will find the answers. But be warned, Jim. The path is not easy. It is filled with dangers, both physical and otherworldly. Many have tried before you, but they never returned." Jim felt his breath catch in his throat. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. But something inside him told him that he had no choice. This was his destiny. He was already too far in to back out now. "I'll do it," Jim said, his voice resolute. The man nodded, a small hint of approval in his eyes. "Good. You're the only one who can." With that, he turned and walked toward the back of the cabin, leaving Jim with more questions than answers, but a sense of purpose that had eluded him for years. Jim took one last look at the map, the strange symbols still haunting his thoughts. Whatever was waiting for him in that cave, it was clear that his life was about to change forever. The air grew colder as Jim and Shadow began their ascent up the mountain, the dimming light casting long, foreboding shadows across the snow-covered ground. Jim could feel the weight of the journey ahead, not just physically, but in the uncertainty that clung to the air. The man in the cabin had given him the directions, but the details were still shrouded in mystery. A hidden cave, a powerful secret, dangers waiting. Jim's mind raced with questions, but he knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back. Shadow, ever watchful, walked closely by his side, her ears pricked and eyes scanning the darkening landscape. The further they climbed, the more Jim felt the presence of something ancient, something that had been buried in the mountains for centuries. Each step he took seemed to bring him closer to the unknown, to whatever had been waiting for him since the moment he touched the device in the wrecked jet. They reached a narrow ledge, the wind picking up, howling through the peaks like a warning. The mountains, towering and silent, seemed to watch them, and Jim couldn't shake the feeling that they were being guided, or perhaps herded, to their destination. Shadow let out a low growl as she stopped at the edge of the ledge. Jim instinctively stopped as well, his senses on high alert. He peered into the growing darkness below, unable to see much, but feeling the weight of something large, something heavy, beneath the surface. "Easy, girl," Jim whispered, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. He tightened his grip on his rifle and slowly took a few more steps forward. The path was treacherous, the rocks sharp and the snow thick, but it was clear they were getting closer to something. The sound of rushing water faintly reached Jim's ears, and he knew they were near a river or stream. The man had said the cave was close, hidden somewhere in this rugged part of the mountain. He had also warned Jim of the dangers, but Jim couldn't ignore the feeling that the real threat wasn't the physical obstacles in his way. It was what lay ahead, what was waiting for him in the shadows of the mountain. After a few more minutes of climbing, they reached a small outcrop of rocks that overlooked a dark, still pool of water. The stream that ran into the pool gurgled softly, its sound oddly calming, but it also marked a boundary, a place where Jim had to make a choice. He had come this far, and the secret the man spoke of, the power hidden deep in the mountain, was almost within reach. "It's time," Jim muttered to Shadow, who looked up at him with a mixture of trust and uncertainty in her eyes. Together, they crossed to the other side of the pool, the path narrowing and growing steeper as they made their way deeper into the heart of the mountain. The darkness thickened around them, the only light coming from the faint glow of the device still hidden in Jim's pack. It felt like a pulse, a heartbeat, and Jim's chest tightened with anticipation and fear. After what felt like hours of climbing, the trail finally opened up into a wide cavern. The air inside was thick with dust, and the walls of the cave were lined with strange markings, symbols, some familiar, others foreign. They glowed faintly, illuminating the cave just enough for Jim to see the path ahead. He felt a shiver run down his spine. This was no natural cave. It was as if someone, or something, had shaped it, had carved it out of the very bones of the mountain. He glanced at Shadow, who was already ahead of him, sniffing the air, her tail slightly raised in alert. "This is it," Jim whispered, stepping cautiously into the cavern. The air was heavy with an ancient energy, and Jim's instincts told him that he was not alone. The faint hum from the device in his pack seemed to grow louder the deeper they ventured into the cave, its pulse quickening, synchronizing with the beat of his own heart. The walls of the cavern narrowed, and ahead of them, Jim saw a faint light, a golden glow, coming from the heart of the cave. He couldn't help but feel drawn to it, as if it was calling to him. As they approached, the light intensified, and Jim's breath caught in his throat. What lay ahead was unlike anything he had ever seen. A large stone altar stood in the center of the cave, surrounded by the same strange symbols that adorned the walls. The altar was carved from an iridescent stone that shimmered with an otherworldly glow, and on it, resting within an intricately carved basin, was an object, a sphere, smooth and flawless, unlike anything Jim could comprehend. It radiated power, its surface reflecting the light in ways that defied physics. Jim's pulse quickened, and he stepped closer, unable to look away. His hand reached for the sphere, but as his fingers brushed its surface, the ground beneath him trembled. A deep rumbling filled the cave, and for a moment, Jim felt as though the entire mountain was coming alive, shifting around him. The light from the sphere flared, blindingly bright, and Jim stumbled back, his heart racing. Shadow barked in warning, her body rigid, and Jim felt a cold chill wash over him. The rumbling grew louder, and the cave seemed to pulse with energy, as if something ancient had been awakened. Jim's instincts screamed at him to run, to escape the power that was now surging through the cave, but his feet wouldn't move. The sphere began to glow even brighter, and then, in a flash of light, everything went silent. Jim blinked, trying to process what had just happened. The light from the sphere had vanished, and the cave was once again shrouded in darkness. But Jim felt it. Something had changed. Something had been unlocked. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew, deep down, that his life would never be the same again. Jim stood there, frozen in the dark cavern, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to make sense of what had just occurred. The glowing sphere, the tremor in the ground, and the strange silence that had followed. It all felt like a dream, a nightmare even. His eyes flicked to Shadow, who was still on edge, her ears perked and her body stiff. She was as aware of the shift in the air as he was. But what troubled Jim most was that the sense of danger had not diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger, more palpable. He reached down into his pack, his fingers brushing the edge of the device from the jet. The hum from it was faint now, but still present, like a heartbeat beneath his skin. The feeling in his chest was undeniable. He had touched something ancient, something that had been waiting here for a long time, perhaps centuries. But what was it? And why was it calling to him? His instincts told him to leave, to retreat before it was too late. But his curiosity, his need for answers, held him in place. He needed to understand what was happening, what he had uncovered in this mountain. With Shadow by his side, Jim took a step forward toward the altar, his boots crunching softly on the stone floor. The markings on the walls seemed to shift with his movements, as though they were alive, reacting to his presence. He paused at the altar, feeling the heat radiating from the sphere, though it wasn't physical warmth. It was something deeper, something almost spiritual. As his hand hovered above the smooth surface, the ground trembled again, a subtle but unsettling vibration. Jim glanced over at Shadow, her fur standing on end, her tail low. It was clear that whatever was happening wasn't something natural. He was no longer sure if he was in control of the situation. The presence of the cave, the altar, the sphere, it was as though they were all interconnected, part of some intricate puzzle he was meant to solve. But why him? Why had he been drawn here? Jim took a deep breath and carefully placed his hand on the sphere. The moment his skin made contact, a jolt of energy shot through him, electric and sharp. His body stiffened as visions flashed before his eyes, strange symbols, shadows of people, a world that seemed to exist in another time, another place. He saw mountains much like these, but different, older, and covered in a strange mist. The people in his vision were dressed in clothing he didn't recognize, their faces familiar yet distant, as if they had been lost to time. The flash lasted only a few seconds, but in that brief moment, Jim felt an overwhelming sense of loss, as if he were witnessing the end of something, the beginning of something else. His hand shot back from the sphere, and the visions faded. The ground stopped trembling, but the silence was deafening. He stood there, breathing heavily, trying to process what he had just experienced. What had that been? Was it a memory? A warning? Or was it simply his mind trying to make sense of the power in this place? Shadow nudged him, snapping him out of his daze. She was looking at him with those wise, amber eyes, waiting for him to act. Jim glanced at her, then back to the altar. The sphere still pulsed, its glow faint but steady. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to do something, to unlock whatever secret the mountain was hiding. He stepped back, suddenly aware of the weight of his decision. The man in the cabin had been right. This was far bigger than he had imagined. This wasn't just about the jet, the device, or the mysterious cave. This was something that could change everything. And Jim was right in the middle of it. As if on cue, a low sound echoed through the cave, a deep rumble that seemed to come from within the stone itself. Jim turned, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. But before he could react, the rumbling grew louder, the air thickening with tension. The walls of the cave seemed to close in on him, the ancient markings glowing brighter, casting strange shadows around the cavern. Shadow barked once, her eyes locked on the entrance to the cave. Jim followed her gaze, his heart racing. Something was coming. Something that had been hidden for centuries was now awake. The air felt charged, alive with energy, and Jim knew in that moment that he had no choice but to face whatever was coming. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but the path was clear. He had to continue. With one last look at the altar, he turned and headed toward the cave's entrance, Shadow at his heels. The rumbling had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the air. The cave seemed to pulse, its ancient power reaching out to him, drawing him forward. Jim could feel the weight of what was to come, and though he was afraid, there was a part of him that knew this was just the beginning of a journey that would reveal the truth, whatever that truth might be. The air outside the cave was bitterly cold, the wind whipping across the jagged mountain peaks with an almost angry force. Jim paused just beyond the entrance, his breath visible in the frosty air as he took a moment to gather his thoughts. Shadow stood beside him, her ears flicking, her body tense. Jim couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them, something ancient and powerful. The sense of being watched had only grown stronger as they had left the cave, and now, with the wind howling around him, it was impossible to ignore. He glanced at Shadow, who was staring intently at the dark expanse before them. Whatever was out there, whatever they had awoken, it wasn't done with them yet. Jim tightened his grip on his rifle and adjusted the straps of his pack. His body ached from the climb, but his mind was still racing. He had no idea what had just happened in the cave, but he couldn't ignore the strange energy that pulsed through him, nor the pull toward the mountainside. The man in the cabin had warned him. This was bigger than anything Jim had ever faced, and it wasn't just a secret buried in the mountain. It was something far older, something that had been waiting for centuries to be found. And now that it had been awakened, there was no going back. Shadow barked once, snapping him out of his thoughts. Jim turned, and his heart skipped a beat as he saw a faint light in the distance. It wasn't the pale glow of the stars or the moonlight reflecting off the snow. It was too bright, too intense. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Shadow's growl deepened, her body coiled, ready to spring. Without thinking, Jim started forward, his legs moving on their own as he followed the light. It wasn't long before they reached a clearing, the snow crunching underfoot. In the center of the clearing was a massive structure, partially hidden by the trees and the thick fog that had started to roll in. It wasn't a natural formation. The walls were too symmetrical, too deliberate. Jim's breath caught in his throat as he realized what it was. A temple. A forgotten structure, half sunken into the mountainside, but unmistakable. His pulse quickened as he moved closer, his eyes scanning the walls for any signs of life or danger. The air around the temple felt heavy, thick with energy, and Jim could feel it in his bones. Shadow barked again, her voice sharp and warning. Jim slowed, his heart pounding. "What is it, girl?" he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the wind. He reached for the flashlight in his pack, flicking it on and shining it toward the entrance of the temple. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating strange symbols etched into the stone. The markings were identical to those he had seen inside the cave. Jim's stomach tightened. This wasn't just an ancient building. It was connected to everything he had uncovered so far. The jet, the device, the sphere in the cave, it was all part of this. This temple was the key, the center of whatever secret the mountain had been guarding. But what was the secret? Jim couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at him. Something had been waiting here, hidden away for a reason. Something that, once awakened, could change the world. He stepped forward, the cold air seeping into his bones as he crossed the threshold of the temple. Inside, the atmosphere was stiflingly still. The stone walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and the air smelled faintly of incense. Ancient, almost forgotten. A series of large stone pillars stood in a circle at the center of the room, and at the very heart of the space, something caught Jim's eye. A stone altar, smooth and polished, its surface gleaming faintly in the flashlight's beam. And on that altar, resting within a carved basin, was another object. It was small, rectangular, and covered in the same glowing symbols that had been on the jet's device. Jim's breath caught in his throat as he approached it, his fingers itching to touch it. Shadow stood behind him, her body tense, every sense alert. Jim could feel the pulse of the object before he even touched it. The vibrations were faint but distinct, like the hum of the device in his pack. The closer he got, the more the room seemed to close in around him, the air growing heavier, the temperature dropping. He reached for the object, his heart racing. The moment his fingers brushed against its surface, the room shook violently. A loud crack echoed through the chamber, and Jim staggered back, barely managing to keep his footing. The symbols on the walls flashed brightly, and a blinding light filled the space. Jim squeezed his eyes shut, the intensity of the light overwhelming. When the light finally faded, he opened his eyes to find the altar had changed. The object was gone, but in its place was a door, a hidden door, carved into the stone, its edges glowing with the same eerie light. Jim took a step forward, his mind reeling. Had he just triggered something? Had he awakened whatever was meant to be found? He had no choice but to move forward. With a deep breath, he reached for the door, his fingers trembling. As he pushed it open, the sound of grinding stone filled the room, and a passage revealed itself, winding deep into the heart of the mountain. Jim's heart raced. This was it. The truth. Whatever lay ahead, it was the culmination of everything he had uncovered so far. He wasn't sure if he was ready for it, but he knew he had no choice. Shadow stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. With one last glance at the chamber, Jim stepped forward into the unknown. The stone door groaned as Jim pushed it open, revealing a narrow, winding passage that descended into the heart of the mountain. The air was thick and damp, the smell of earth and stone overwhelming. A faint, pulsating light from the depths of the tunnel beckoned him forward, and Jim's heart pounded with a mix of fear and anticipation. Shadow, ever watchful, stood by his side, her senses alert to every sound, every movement in the oppressive darkness. The narrow passage felt suffocating, the walls close around him as if the mountain itself was tightening its grip, warning him to turn back. But Jim couldn't stop now. He had come too far. The device, the jet, the temple, it was all leading here, to this moment, to the heart of whatever secret had been buried for so long. His footsteps echoed softly in the silence, the sound swallowed by the walls as he descended deeper. He had no idea how far the tunnel stretched or what lay at its end, but the pull of the unknown was impossible to ignore. The light ahead grew stronger with each step, flickering like the last embers of a dying fire. Jim's breath came in shallow gasps as the tunnel opened up into a vast chamber. The walls were lined with strange symbols, the same markings he had seen in the cave and on the jet, glowing faintly in the dim light. In the center of the chamber was a massive stone structure, an altar much like the one he had seen earlier, but this one was far more intricate. Carved into its surface were patterns, lines, and symbols, all leading to a central point where a large crystal sat, its surface glowing with a soft, otherworldly light. Jim's breath caught in his throat as he approached the altar. The energy in the room was overwhelming, thick with the same force he had felt earlier. It felt ancient, powerful, and alive. The air buzzed with an electric charge that made his skin tingle. He reached out instinctively, his hand trembling as he touched the crystal. The moment his fingers made contact, a surge of energy shot through him, flooding his senses. Visions flashed before his eyes, strange images of people, places, and events that seemed both distant and familiar. It was as if the crystal was unlocking memories, secrets, and truths long forgotten. His heart raced as the visions grew more vivid, the images becoming clearer. He saw a civilization, ancient and advanced, its people living in harmony with the mountain, with the earth itself. They had discovered something powerful, something that had been hidden away in the mountain for centuries. But then, the vision shifted. A great catastrophe. The civilization fell, the mountain closed, and the secrets were buried, forgotten by time. And in the last moments of the vision, he saw a figure, a man, standing in front of the crystal, just like he was now. The figure's face was hidden, but Jim could feel the weight of his presence. It was as if the figure was watching him, waiting for him to understand. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Jim breathless and disoriented. He staggered back from the altar, his mind racing. What had he just seen? What was the crystal? And why had it shown him these images? As he regained his footing, the ground beneath him shook, the vibrations running up through his legs. The walls of the chamber groaned, and the symbols on the stone flickered and changed. Jim's heart pounded in his chest as the room seemed to come alive, the energy around him pulsing with increasing intensity. Shadow barked once, her voice sharp and warning, and Jim spun around, his pulse quickening. The entrance to the chamber had closed. The passage he had come through was now sealed, and the only way out was the same way he had entered. He was trapped. Panic rose in his chest as he turned back to the altar, his mind racing. But then, something shifted. The crystal on the altar began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that resonated in the air. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and Jim could feel the air growing thick, heavy with power. The symbols on the walls were no longer just markings. They were alive, shifting, changing, as if the very mountain was responding to the crystal's energy. And then, before his eyes, a section of the wall slid open, revealing a hidden passage. Jim's heart skipped a beat. Was this the way out? Or was it something else? Without hesitation, he moved toward the passage, his footsteps echoing in the silent chamber. The energy in the room was almost suffocating now, thick with an ancient force that seemed to be drawing him deeper into the mountain. Shadow followed closely, her body tense, her instincts telling her to be ready for whatever lay ahead. As Jim entered the passage, the door behind him closed with a heavy thud, and he was plunged into darkness once more. But this time, he wasn't alone. The air around him seemed to hum, a low, constant vibration that matched the pulsing energy of the crystal. Jim couldn't see where the passage led, but the faint glow of the crystal still lingered in the back of his mind, urging him forward. The tunnel stretched out before him, the walls narrow and close, and Jim knew that there was no turning back now. Whatever had been hidden in these mountains was waiting for him, and he was the only one who could uncover it. The passage narrowed as Jim moved deeper into the mountain, the walls of the tunnel closing in on him. The air was thick with a strange, electrifying energy, the same energy he had felt in the cave and the temple. It hummed through the stone like a living force, guiding him forward. Shadow, ever alert, walked beside him, her steps quiet, her body tense as she scanned the darkness ahead. The only sound was the faint echo of their footsteps, the oppressive silence closing in around them. As they moved deeper into the mountain, Jim felt the pull of the unknown intensifying. It was as if the mountain itself was calling to him, urging him to go further, to uncover whatever it had been hiding for centuries. The walls of the tunnel glowed faintly, the same ancient symbols now etched into the stone. The energy pulsed in time with his heartbeat, each step taking him closer to the heart of the mystery. After what felt like an eternity, Jim reached a door. The stone was smooth, unmarked, and solid, no symbols, no carvings. But as he approached, the faintest light began to seep through the cracks, and he felt a surge of power, a magnetic pull, drawing him in. He reached out, his hand trembling as it touched the door. The moment his fingers made contact, the door shifted, sliding open with a soft groan, revealing what lay beyond. The room was vast, much larger than he had imagined, its high ceiling lost in the shadows. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed for centuries. The faint glow from the walls revealed a long chamber, lined with stone pillars that stretched to the ceiling. At the far end of the room stood another altar, much larger than the one he had seen before. But this one was different. Instead of the crystal, there was a large, circular stone set into the ground, surrounded by strange symbols. Jim felt a shiver run down his spine as he stepped into the room, the air growing even colder. Shadow growled low, her ears flat against her head, and Jim instinctively reached for his rifle, his senses heightened. Something was wrong. As he stepped closer to the altar, he noticed the walls were lined with faded murals, their colors long since faded, but still visible. The murals depicted strange, alien scenes, people or creatures, Jim couldn't tell, worshipping the stone, their faces twisted in expressions of awe and fear. At the center of the mural, a figure stood with its arms raised, its face hidden in shadow. The figure seemed to be controlling the stone, or perhaps it was being controlled by it. Jim's heart raced as he took in the scene, the meaning of the murals slowly sinking in. This place, this altar, was not just a relic. It was a focal point, a place of power, where something ancient had been worshipped. But what was it? And why had it been hidden for so long? Shadow's growl deepened as she stepped forward, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. Jim glanced down at her, his hand still on the rifle, but his mind was racing. He stepped closer to the altar, the stone now glowing faintly, the symbols around it pulsing in time with the energy he could feel coursing through the chamber. The air seemed to vibrate, and Jim could almost hear the low hum of the stone itself. He knelt down in front of the altar, his hand hovering just above the stone, and for a moment, he felt an overwhelming urge to touch it. His fingers brushed the surface, and in that instant, the room exploded with light. The ground trembled violently beneath his feet, and Jim was thrown back, his head slamming into the stone floor. Pain shot through his body, but his vision remained clear. He could feel the energy, now coursing through the entire room, filling the air with an unnatural force. Shadow barked, her body rigid as she circled around him, her eyes locked on the altar. Jim's chest heaved as he struggled to his feet, his senses spinning. He had touched the stone, and now the mountain was reacting to it. The murals on the walls shifted, their figures seeming to come to life, their eyes following him as the energy in the room intensified. The stone at the center of the altar began to glow brighter, pulsing with power as if it had been awakened from a deep slumber. Jim felt his heart race, a cold sweat breaking out across his brow. The energy was overwhelming, and he knew that he was no longer just a witness to whatever was happening. He was part of it. The room continued to tremble, the walls shaking with the force of the energy. Jim staggered back, his mind racing. What had he just unleashed? What had he disturbed? The stone seemed to hum louder, its pulse growing stronger with each passing second. Jim's breath quickened as he backed away from the altar, trying to make sense of the chaos around him. He didn't know how much longer he could stay in this place. The mountain itself felt like it was alive, responding to the touch of the stone, and Jim knew that whatever secret it had been hiding was no longer buried. It had been awakened, and there was no turning back. The room trembled as the energy surged through the stone altar. Jim staggered back, his heart racing. The vibrations from the stone pulsed through his body, each wave stronger than the last. Shadow barked again, her voice sharp and urgent, but Jim could barely hear her over the deafening hum filling the chamber. The walls, covered in strange symbols, were glowing brighter, their once dim lines now alive with a powerful energy that felt as though it was awakening something long dormant beneath the mountain. Jim's hand went instinctively to the rifle slung across his back, but he knew that whatever force had been unleashed by touching the stone would not be stopped by anything as simple as a weapon. He turned around, desperate for a way out, but the entrance had vanished. The tunnel, the passage he had come through, was now sealed. He was trapped. The ground shook beneath his feet as the hum grew louder, reverberating through the stone walls. Shadow growled again, her body rigid, and Jim could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. He looked back at the altar, where the stone glowed brighter still. The energy it emitted was no longer just a hum. It was a force, alive, pulsating, and relentless. Jim could feel it in his chest, pushing against him as if demanding his attention. He had to understand what was happening. He had to find a way to stop it before it consumed him and the mountain. As he moved toward the altar, a strange wind rushed through the chamber, despite the lack of any apparent source. It seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, swirling around him with a force that made the temperature drop even further. Jim tightened his grip on his rifle and stepped closer, his mind racing. The symbols on the altar were shifting, rearranging themselves as if the stone was communicating with the energy that filled the room. It was then that Jim realized the truth. This wasn't just a stone. It wasn't just an altar. It was a gateway, a doorway to something far older, far more powerful than anything he had imagined. And it had been waiting for him. The vibrations grew stronger, and Jim staggered, feeling his legs give way beneath him. He dropped to his knees, clutching at the floor as the ground beneath him seemed to ripple like water. Shadow whined, her body low to the ground as she crouched beside him, her eyes wide with fear. Jim's mind raced. The chamber was alive. The mountain was alive. and he had awoken it. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just a discovery. This was a choice. He had been drawn here for a reason. But what was it? What was he supposed to do now? The air in the chamber thickened, almost to the point of suffocation, and Jim could feel the walls closing in on him. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as the power of the altar pressed against him, as though it was trying to force him to make a decision. He could feel the weight of the choice before him. Go deeper, embrace the unknown, or leave and never look back. But as he looked around the chamber, at the symbols that glowed and pulsed around him, Jim realized there was no going back. The mountain had already chosen him. The stone had already chosen him. His role in this was already sealed. But what exactly was that role? What was this force that had been hidden for so long, waiting to be discovered? As if in response to his thoughts, the stone on the altar flared with light, and Jim felt his mind snap into focus. He saw it then, visions, flashing images of a time long past. The ancient civilization that had lived here, the people who had once harnessed the power of the mountain. They had built this place, this altar, to control the energy that flowed through the earth, to tap into something far beyond their understanding. And then, just as quickly as the visions had appeared, they faded. But in their wake, Jim understood. The power he was feeling wasn't just energy. It was the lifeblood of the earth itself, the very heart of the mountain, a force that had been tapped into by the ancient civilization and then sealed away for centuries. The question now was whether Jim could control it, or if it would consume him like it had consumed those who had come before him. He didn't have much time to think. The ground shook again, more violently this time, and the altar seemed to pulse with an urgency that filled the room. The mountain was waking up, and Jim, for better or worse, was at its heart. He stood slowly, his legs still shaking from the force of the energy around him, and glanced once more at the stone. Shadow growled low, and Jim knew they were not alone. Something was coming. Something had been unleashed. He didn't know if he was ready for what was about to happen, but he knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The vibrations in the room grew more intense, the very ground beneath Jim's feet shifting as if the mountain itself was alive, responding to the energy now coursing through it. Shadow barked sharply, her eyes locked on something in the growing darkness, her hackles raised. Jim's heart pounded in his chest as he spun around, searching for whatever threat had stirred his dog. The chamber was still, but the air was thick, charged with an unnatural power that seemed to suffocate everything in its reach. Jim's mind raced, his thoughts desperately trying to catch up with the chaos unfolding around him. Whatever ancient force had been buried deep within these mountains, whatever it was he had just unlocked, was no longer content to stay hidden. It was awake, and it was calling to him. Jim's hand tightened around the rifle he had kept close, his instincts screaming at him to be ready. But as the seconds passed, the sense of dread only grew stronger. The walls around him, those strange symbols and markings that had seemed dormant before, were now alive, shifting and glowing with an intensity that made Jim's skin crawl. The room felt as though it was closing in, the walls pulsating with energy as the ground trembled beneath his feet. Then, the sound of a deep, guttural growl echoed from the far side of the room. Jim's breath caught in his throat as he turned to face the source of the sound. His flashlight flickered and buzzed, the light dimming with each passing moment, until it finally died, leaving only the faint glow from the walls to guide him. The shadows shifted, and Jim's breath caught in his throat as a figure emerged from the darkness. At first, it was just a silhouette, its shape indistinct in the dim light, but as it stepped closer, Jim could make out its features, tall, shadowy, with eyes that glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. The figure was humanoid, but its movements were strange, jerky, as if it didn't belong in this world. Jim instinctively raised his rifle, but the figure made no move to attack. Instead, it simply stood there, watching him with eyes that seemed to pierce through him, as though it could see the very core of his being. The figure's voice, when it came, was deep and resonant, echoing through the chamber as if coming from all directions at once. "You should not have come here," it said, its voice a chilling mixture of menace and something far older, far more ancient. Jim's heart raced. He had heard tales, stories from other soldiers who had faced things they couldn't explain. But this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. "What are you?" Jim demanded, his voice low but steady. The figure's glowing eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed to consider him. "I am the Guardian," it replied, its voice a low hum that vibrated through Jim's bones. "The one who has watched over this place for centuries, ensuring that the power of the mountain remains sealed. You have disturbed it, awakened it from its slumber." Jim took a step back, his mind racing. He had heard of guardians, of beings tasked with protecting ancient secrets, but this felt different. This wasn't some myth or legend. It was real, standing before him in the flesh. "What power?" Jim asked, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, its form shimmering with an ethereal light. "The power of the mountain," it said, "the power that sustains this land, that binds the earth and the sky. The power that has been hidden for millennia, waiting for someone worthy enough to unlock it. And now that it has been awakened, it cannot be contained. Not by you. Not by anyone." The air around Jim seemed to grow heavier, pressing in on him, the walls vibrating with the figure's every word. "What do you want from me?" Jim asked, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the overwhelming situation. The Guardian's eyes softened, and it took a step forward. "I want nothing from you," it said. "But you have a choice to make. You can leave now, return to the world you know, and forget this ever happened. Or you can stay, face the power you have awoken, and accept the consequences." Jim felt his pulse quicken, 1,000 questions racing through his mind. What was this power? What did it mean for him? And what would happen if he stayed? "What are the consequences?" Jim asked, though he already knew that whatever answer the Guardian gave would not be one he could easily walk away from. The figure's gaze darkened, and it stepped back, as if the weight of the mountain itself was shifting in its presence. "The consequences are not mine to decide," it said. "The mountain will judge you, and it will decide if you are worthy of the power you seek. If you are not, you will be consumed, like those who came before you." The words hit Jim like a punch to the gut. He had come this far, but now, standing before the Guardian and hearing the true cost of his actions, he realized just how deep he had dug himself into this mess. There was no turning back now. He had already made his choice when he stepped into this place, and whatever came next, he would have to face it. The figure's form began to shimmer, its edges blurring like smoke, and Jim took one last look at the Guardian. "Stay or leave," the figure's voice echoed. "The choice is yours." And with that, it disappeared, leaving Jim alone in the cavern, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. Shadow stood at his side, her eyes still watchful, but now filled with a knowing sadness. Jim turned and looked toward the glowing stone altar, the pulsating energy still hanging in the air. He knew there was no going back now. He had unlocked something ancient, and whatever came next, he would face it, head on. Jim stood alone in the cavern, the echoes of the Guardian's final words still reverberating in his mind. The air in the room was thick with an energy that pressed against him, its weight almost tangible. Shadow was at his side, her body tense, her eyes scanning the darkness that had swallowed the Guardian's form. Jim knew that he was at a crossroads, a moment in time where every decision would lead to an irreversible consequence. The mountain had chosen him, and now, the full extent of that choice was becoming clearer with each passing second. The stone altar glowed faintly, its energy pulsing in rhythm with the beating of his heart. He could feel it now, deep within his chest, a hum, a vibration that seemed to resonate with the very core of the mountain. He had touched something ancient, something that had been waiting, hidden beneath the earth for centuries. It was no accident that he had found it, no chance that he had stumbled upon the jet and the device. This was all part of something much larger than him. Jim took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Shadow moved closer to him, pressing her body against his leg, as if offering silent support. He reached down, resting his hand on her fur, and closed his eyes for a moment, trying to clear his mind. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it head on. Slowly, he turned back to the altar. The energy from the stone was stronger now, almost overwhelming. Jim could feel it pulling at him, urging him to step closer, to unlock the secrets that lay buried in the mountain. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to approach. As he stepped forward, the symbols on the altar flickered, their glowing lines shifting and changing before his eyes. The air grew colder, and the light in the room dimmed, casting long shadows across the walls. Jim stopped just in front of the altar, his fingers hovering over the stone. He could sense something, an intelligence in the energy that surrounded him, as if the mountain itself was watching, waiting for him to make his move. He took a deep breath and placed his hand on the stone. The moment his skin touched it, a jolt of energy shot through him, more intense than before. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he saw flashes of the past. Images of the ancient civilization that had once lived in harmony with the mountain, their faces filled with awe and fear as they gazed upon the very stone he was now touching. He saw them build, construct, and protect this place, their lives intertwined with the power that lay beneath the earth. But then, the images shifted. He saw a great disaster, a cataclysm that tore the civilization apart, the mountain shaking with an uncontrollable fury as the power within it was unleashed. The people, in their desperation, had sealed the power away, locking it deep within the mountain to protect the world from its destructive force. And now, centuries later, Jim had found it. He had awakened it. The vision ended abruptly, and Jim gasped, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts as he stumbled backward from the altar. His mind was spinning, the weight of what he had just witnessed almost too much to bear. The energy in the room was pulsating, the stone still glowing, and he knew that the power was ready to be unleashed. He could feel it. Something ancient and powerful was stirring within him. The mountain was alive, and Jim was its chosen conduit. As the reality of his situation sank in, the room seemed to grow darker, the air thick with an oppressive force. The walls trembled, and the ground beneath his feet shook once more. Jim felt his body tense, his muscles tightening in anticipation of what was to come. Shadow barked, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and alertness. She could feel it too, the presence that was now awakening, and Jim knew they had no time to waste. He had to make a choice, stay and face whatever came next, or leave and risk the power of the mountain consuming them both. But there was no choice. He had already made it the moment he stepped into this place. The mountain had chosen him. Jim turned back to the altar, his eyes locked on the glowing stone. The energy surrounding it was overwhelming now, a force that seemed to call to him, beckoning him to take the next step. He reached for the stone once more, his fingers brushing against its surface. The moment he touched it, a surge of power shot through him, flooding his senses. His body vibrated with the energy, his mind racing with the realization that he was no longer just a witness to this power. He was part of it, bound to it in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The world around him seemed to disappear, leaving only the pulsing light of the altar and the energy coursing through his veins. He could feel it now, a connection between him and the mountain, a bond that went deeper than anything he had ever experienced. The air was thick with power, and Jim knew that there was no going back. Whatever happened next, he would have to face it. The mountain had chosen him, and now he was its heir. Jim's hand hovered over the stone, his fingers trembling as the energy coursed through his body, filling him with a power he couldn't comprehend. His heart raced, and the room around him seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own, as if the very walls were breathing, alive with ancient energy. Shadow stood by his side, her fur raised and her body tense, sensing the same overwhelming force that Jim was feeling. He could feel the mountain's power surging through him, binding him to it, and for a moment, everything else faded. He was no longer just a man. He was part of the mountain. The connection was undeniable, and the weight of it pressed on him, filling his chest with both fear and awe. The visions that had plagued him earlier returned, but this time, they were clearer, sharper. He saw the ancient civilization once again, their faces filled with wonder as they unlocked the secrets of the mountain. They had known the power that lay beneath, and they had harnessed it, using it to build their civilization and protect the world from dangers both seen and unseen. But with that power came consequences. Jim saw the downfall of the civilization, their greed and desperation leading to their downfall as they sought to control something they were never meant to. The mountain had been their protector, but it had also been their prison. And now, Jim had become part of the legacy they had left behind. The visions faded, leaving Jim breathless and shaken. His mind struggled to make sense of what he had just seen. Was this the power he had awakened? The same power that had destroyed the ancient civilization? Or was it something different, something that had been waiting for him, something that had chosen him for a reason? As the energy continued to pulse around him, Jim felt a surge of determination. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The mountain had chosen him, and it was time to face whatever lay ahead. He looked down at the glowing stone, the energy swirling around it, and felt the weight of his decision. He could take the power, use it, or he could leave it behind, sealing it away once again. But Jim knew he could never leave. Not after everything he had seen, not after feeling the bond with the mountain. He had to know the truth. He had to understand the power he had awakened. With a steady hand, Jim reached for the stone. The moment his fingers touched it, the energy erupted, flooding his senses with a wave of power so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. The walls of the chamber shook violently, and the ground beneath him trembled. Jim gritted his teeth, refusing to let go, as the power surged through him, connecting him to the very heart of the mountain. It was as if the mountain itself was speaking to him, its ancient voice whispering in his mind. The power, the energy, it was alive, and it was telling him something. He could hear the words now, faint but clear. You are the keeper now, the guardian of the mountain. Jim's body tensed as the realization hit him. He wasn't just a witness to this power. He was its protector. The responsibility was immense, and the weight of it nearly brought him to his knees. But in that moment, he understood. He had been brought here for a reason. The ancient civilization had failed to protect the power, but Jim had the chance to do what they could not. He was the one who would ensure the power stayed locked away, safe from those who would seek to use it for their own gain. As the energy from the stone began to subside, Jim stood tall, his mind still reeling, but now filled with purpose. The mountain was no longer a place of fear. It was his responsibility now, and he would protect it at all costs. The light from the stone faded, leaving the room in near darkness. But Jim's senses were heightened, his connection to the mountain stronger than ever. Shadow stood beside him, her body relaxed but alert, as if she too understood the weight of the moment. Jim took a deep breath, his heart steadying as the last of the energy dissipated. He had made his choice. The power was his to protect. With one last look at the stone, Jim turned and began to walk back through the cavern. The mountain had chosen him, and now he would live with the consequences. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer just a man wandering through the wilderness. He was the mountain's keeper, its protector, and with Shadow at his side, he would ensure that the power would never again fall into the wrong hands. In this gripping tale, a veteran discovers a hidden mountain secret that has been buried for centuries. The story begins with an old jet crash and a mysterious device, leading the veteran on a journey into the heart of the mountains. As he uncovers the truth, the power of the mountain itself seems to awaken, testing his strength and determination. With his loyal dog by his side, the veteran must navigate dangerous passages and face ancient forces that have been locked away for generations. As he learns the ancient civilization's tragic fate, the veteran realizes he is the key to protecting the power that could change the world. The mountain has chosen him as its guardian, and his life will never be the same again. This veteran story is a thrilling mix of mystery, supernatural elements, and an unbreakable bond between man and dog. Join him as he uncovers long-forgotten truths and fights to keep the power of the mountain safe. The veteran must face his fears, and the consequences of his choices will alter the course of his destiny. If you love veteran stories full of suspense, ancient mysteries, and unexpected twists, this journey into the unknown will keep you on the edge of your seat.